A 3-year-old girl was abused by her stepmother and locked in a cowshed filled with the stench of manure. It seemed her life was about to end until a mysterious millionaire happened to pass by the farm and walked in to open the door no one else dared to touch. The wind howled across the field, slipping through the cracks of the old cowshed's wooden boards. The night air was heavy, like an unwashed curtain draped over everything, damp, cold, and soaked with the stench of cow manure. In the corner of the shed, a small child curled up, a torn blanket barely covering her shivering body. Lori wasn't asleep, she had tried, but the cold seeped into her fingertips, hunger twisted her stomach, and the smell of manure stung her eyes too much to keep them shut. Her mouth was sealed with tape, even breathing through her nose made her gag. Her hands were loosely tied with an old scarf, and straw stuck to her skin. The 3-year-old no longer called out. In the early days of being locked up, she had screamed, "Daddy," until her voice gave out. She had stretched her body, crying into the void. Not anymore. Now, there was only silence, and the only thing still moving was the heart inside her, beating out of sheer habit. Lucky, the old dog, sat by the shed door. He had been hit a few times for barking at night, called a filthy mutt who only wagged his tail for kids, but he never left. He stayed, and tonight he stood still, like an aging guard on duty. From the main house, the sound of slippers dragged across the concrete floor. Then, a voice, soft as a breath, just loud enough to drown out the wind. "You called at the perfect time," Sylvia said, putting her phone on speaker and adjusting the collar of her cardigan. Her voice was sweet, gentle, and rehearsed, like a memorized script. "She's asleep now. I told her a fairy tale, and she even asked for a lullaby." The man on the other end sounded unsuspecting. "So, she's getting used to you." "You're doing great, Sylvia. I feel relieved." Sylvia looked toward the cowshed, her smile as thin and lifeless as someone looking at an old, dried stain. "I'm just doing what any mother should do." The call ended, and her face fell in an instant, her eyes void of emotion. She turned and slid open the cowshed door with one hand. Clack. The door creaked open, the hinges groaning weakly. Lucky let out a low growl, not fierce but steady. He didn't back away, he stood between the girl and the woman approaching. Sylvia didn't even look at him. She ripped the tape from Lori's mouth. The girl flinched and coughed, her lips cracked and stained with dried blood. "Cry again, and I'll stuff your mouth with straw." The girl didn't cry. She just looked at Lucky, trembling as Sylvia bent closer. Lori instinctively raised a frail hand in front of the dog, trying to shield him. Sylvia saw it, her mouth curled. "Still calling for Daddy?" "I heard it. Keep dreaming. Your dad doesn't want you." "He only calls me." Lori turned her face away. "Calling me Mum now," Sylvia scoffed, almost spitting the words out. "Your mum's dead. Died giving birth to you. You have no one, and me. I don't want to be your mother." Lucky barked, low and sharp, then took a step forward. Sylvia kicked sideways, not hard, but enough. It hit his belly. Lucky crumpled with a whimper but didn't flee. He crawled back to Lori, nestled his head against her arm, and panted fast. Sylvia stepped outside, slamming the shed door shut like closing a coffin lid. She muttered, "Useless thing. Might as well die already." Inside the shed, Lori sat curled up. She had no tears left to cry. The shivering came with each gust of wind, but her body no longer convulsed. Lucky pressed closer, licking her hand gently. Lori looked up at the cracked roof above. Moonlight spilled in through the gaps, scattered like an old, flickering projector light. She spoke very softly, not sure to whom, not sure anyone would hear. "Daddy, I'm cold." The wind whistled through the wooden slats, long, steady, and colder than any answer she would ever receive. The cold still crept through the cracks of the cowshed. Dry straw stuck to the ground like tiny thorns. In the dark corner, Laurie sat huddled, her tiny hands covering her head, trembling not from the cold but from fear. The squeak of dragging slippers stopped right outside the shed door. Click. The door swung open. "Still showing your face here, huh?" Sylvia growled. "How many times do I have to tell you, you disrespectful little brat?" Before Laurie could answer, the woman's hand struck her. Her cheek snapped to the side, her lips split open, but not a tear fell, just a faint whimper, like the last reflex of a soul running on empty. "You think you're some kind of princess? I'm so sick of you." Each word landed with the swipe of a broomstick. Sylvia no longer wore the gentle mask of a proper woman in front of her husband. Right now, she was just a beast in human skin, pouring the frustration of her whole life onto the fragile body before her. Lucky, the old dog, lunged forward. He barked loudly, placing himself between Sylvia and Laurie. Sylvia snarled, swung the broom straight at him. Lucky dodged the first strike, but when the broom came down again, it hit him. He crumpled with a yelp, then turned and ran, not from fear, but because he knew this time he didn't have the strength. At that moment, on a lonely dirt road, a gray SUV stopped by the rocky roadside. Inside, Richard Hale, the man people called a millionaire but who called himself "What's Left," sat still. What was left after an accident that had taken both his wife and his 3-year-old daughter? The dashboard light cast a pale glow across his face, deep-lined after 3 silent years. On the passenger seat, an old leather notebook lay open to its final page, the ink slightly smudged. "Your 3rd birthday. If you were still here, what would you want? Mint ice cream or just to be held in silence?" He read it again and again, then closed the notebook and slipped it into his coat pocket. Richard hadn't come here for business, no appointments, no meetings, just because tonight's cold felt like the night everything ended, and sometimes memory needs no reason to drag you back to where it all began. The SUV shook, the engine light flashed red. He cursed under his breath, pulled out the key, and reached for the door when a shadow appeared near the roadside, a dog, gray-black fur, a limp in its hind leg, around its neck a worn cloth collar with the word "Lucky." It didn't bark, didn't growl, it just looked at him, as if it had been waiting. "What now?" Richard muttered. The dog stepped closer hesitantly, then gently bit the edge of his coat, tugged, let go, tugged again. Richard frowned. "You hungry?" "I've got no food, and I'm no vet either." The dog didn't blink, then walked a few steps, stopped, looked back, walked further, stopped again, looked again. Its eyes weren't just a dog's, they were the eyes of something that knew. Richard stayed put, hands in his pockets, thinking. Part of him wanted to turn away, but the dog came back, this time more insistent. It pushed its head against his leg, clawed the dirt, whined softly, not begging, pleading. "God damn it," he muttered. He grabbed a flashlight from the trunk, switched it on, and followed. The wind grew colder, tall grass scratched at his pants. Ahead, an abandoned farm, bent tin roof, broken wooden fence, and at the end of the path, a silver-gray cowshed, old and haunting. The flashlight swept across the ground, smears of blood. Richard's chest tightened. A loud thud came from inside. He quickened his pace. A whimper, then silence, then a weak bark. The shed door was ajar, wind whistled through the slats. Richard raised his hand, pushed the door open, and froze. What lay before him was a scene no courtroom could contain. The guilt for Laurie curled up in damp straw, surrounded by dried blood, one cheek bruised, her lip torn, both wrists swollen with dark bruises. She held her head, her body trembling like someone in a fever. On her wrist, a faint, blood-specked plastic heart tied with a string, simple, small, but unmistakably familiar, because Richard had tied the same kind to his daughter's wrist once. He couldn't move. The flashlight trembled in his hand, not from wind but from the shaking of his whole body. The child didn't cry, she just looked at him, a silent look, no belief, no hope, no plea, just waiting. Across the shed, Sylvia stood gripping the broom, breathing hard, her eyes wide, her mouth ready to speak. "She's just a kid." She fell. "Stop." Richard's voice cut through the air like steel, low, so low even the wind went still. "Drop the broom." Sylvia's grip tightened, her expression changed. "Who are you? You can't just." Lucky growled, this time a sharp, blade-like growl that sliced the silence. Richard stepped forward, pulling out his phone. "I've already called the police. If they're late, I'll drag you onto every headline in the country." He knelt down, gently lifted Lori from the straw. She was light as air, but the tremble in her body made him feel like he was holding stone. "You're safe now, sweetheart. I'm here." Lori didn't answer, but her chin rested on his shoulder, trembling like the wind at winter's end. One tiny tear slipped down her cheek, quiet and small, but this time someone saw it. Inside the SUV, speeding through the night, Richard Hale fought to keep his hands from shaking. Lori was wrapped tightly in his coat, her tiny body no larger than a folded sleeve. Her eyes were shut tight, her breathing shallow, but it was still there, that, at least, was certain. He drove with one hand, holding her firmly with the other. Her head rested against his chest, her tangled hair clung to his coat, bits of straw stuck to her back. From time to time, she flinched, like someone brushing against a wound that hadn't healed. He held her closer. At the ER entrance, a nurse caught sight of them and pressed the emergency buzzer. A wave of doctors poured out like a tide. Richard leaned down, handing Lori over as if surrendering a broken piece of life. Dr. Rachel Bennett, the chief pediatrician, flinched at the sight of the injuries. She only managed to whisper to Richard, "Critical condition. Too many very bad signs." As Rachel gently placed the child on the stretcher, she leaned in and asked softly, "What's your name, sweetheart?" There was no response, but as Richard bent down and whispered in the child's ear, "I'm here. No one's going to hurt you anymore." Lori opened her eyes. Her lips were dry, cracked, but one fragile word slipped out, "Mom." Rachel asked, "Who is your mom?" The girl looked at Richard, then said, "Mean." Just one word, but it was more than enough. The stretcher disappeared behind the doors, and only then did Richard hear it, the soft, steady clack, clack, clack of claws on cement. He turned, startled. It was Lucky, the dog, limping toward the building from the darkness, covered in scratches, one ear torn, muzzle stained with dried blood, but his eyes still open and fixed straight ahead toward the hospital door. A nurse cried out, "There's a dog." Richard stopped her. "Don't. He's the kid's friend." Lucky reached him, staggering, then collapsed. His chest heaved, but he kept his head up. A man in a white coat appeared from inside, name tag gleaming, Dr. Jeff Wallace, on-call veterinarian. He had just arrived for an emergency call on a stray when the nurse flagged him down. Wallace knelt beside the dog. "Dislocated joint, minor blood loss, cold, and exhaustion, but he's savable." Richard nodded. "Save him. He deserves it more than anyone I've ever met." Lucky was lifted onto a clean cloth stretcher. He didn't bark, didn't resist, he just gave Richard one last look, deep, slow, like a silent goodbye. Meanwhile, Lori was wheeled into the trauma room. Rachel scanned her injuries. She had never seen a child survive this kind of damage and still be breathing, left hand severely bruised, right leg hairline fracture, abdomen deep bruising as if struck repeatedly, lips split, parched wrists, rope marks, back of the head old swelling, no one could tell how long it had been there. Richard stood outside the glass wall, fists clenched, his throat dry as sand. He stared in, as if begging the universe to keep this little soul alive. About an hour later, Lori was transferred to the recovery wing, her condition temporarily stabilized. Sheriff Grant arrived. He approached Richard, notepad in hand. "You the one who called this in?" "Yes." "What's your relation to the child?" "None." I was passing by. Her dog pulled me to the cowshed. What do you know about the person who did this? Richard took a deep breath, his voice steady and cold. A woman who claimed to be the stepmother. I saw her strike the child with a broom, directly, clearly, no mistake. Any confirmation? Yes, from the child herself. When the doctor asked, "Who is your mum?" she said just one word, "Mean." Grant went silent. Meanwhile, in the hospital's temporary holding area, Sylvia sat hunched on a plastic chair, her shirt still dotted with Laurie's blood. An investigator asked, "You confirm you were caring for the child, Laurie James?" "Yes, my husband's daughter. Her mum is dead." "Did you hit her?" "I disciplined her. She was naughty, wouldn't eat, fell a lot. The bruises are from playing around and not listening. And the duct tape on her mouth. She screamed a lot. The neighbors complained. The answers were too smooth, so smooth that Grant chuckled dryly. You're smart, but you forgot the one thing kids don't know how to fake, their eyes. That girl looked at you like she was staring straight at the devil. Sylvia said nothing. For the first time, she didn't argue, not out of guilt, but because she knew it was already too late. In the hospital room, Laurie stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, white ceiling, the smell of medicine, soft lights. For the first time, no broom, no yelling, no Sylvia. Her eyes moved around. She saw the man asleep in the chair beside her bed. A small sound escaped her lips, quiet but enough to wake Richard. "Lucky?" she asked. Richard leaned in immediately. "He's safe, being treated. He's strong. He's a hero." She looked at him. Her eyes still held fear, but they no longer ran. Her hand moved slightly, searching for something to trust. Richard held out his hand, said nothing. She grasped just one of his fingers but held it tightly. "What's your name?" "Laurie." "I'm Richard. From now on, I'll be the one watching over your sleep. No one will ever hurt you again. No one will lock you in the dark again. I promise." Laurie didn't respond, but her eyes closed with a deep, calm breath, the first time someone had stayed by her side until morning. Sunlight streamed softly through the hospital window. The air was clean, sterile, fresh, but no one in that room found it comforting. In the recovery room, Laurie was still asleep, her tiny hands wrapped beneath a fleece blanket, white gauze covering nearly half her face, the rest mottled with bruises, as if someone had painted her fragile skin with spilled ink. Richard sat beside her, his hand never leaving the corner of the blanket where her small hand rested, gripping it tightly as if to make sure he wouldn't disappear. He didn't sleep, didn't close his eyes, he just sat there, as if the moment he let go, the child might vanish again. Footsteps echoed steadily in the hallway. The door opened quietly. Dr. Rachel Bennett, the attending pediatrician, stepped in, clipboard in hand. She glanced at the vital signs monitor, then gave a small nod. "She's stable, but the trauma runs deep, inside and out." Richard said nothing. Rachel sat beside him, her voice softened, turning into something more personal. "I was on call 3 years ago, the night your wife and daughter were brought in after the crash. I never forgot your eyes that night, standing behind the glass, not crying but screaming on the inside." She looked at Laurie. "Last night, when I saw you carrying that little girl through the doors, I recognized those eyes again. But this time, they belonged to a man who wouldn't let her be lost." Richard bowed his head, said nothing. His hand tightened on the blanket. Rachel placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "I don't know who she is to you, but if you want to stay, then that child just got a second chance to live." In the town of Granger, the air was heavy, quiet in the way that only follows after something unspeakable. The story of the little girl locked in a cowshed, bound and gagged, was no longer a rumor, but people still only spoke with their eyes, not their mouths. At the county sheriff's station, the old wooden benches sat under a dusty windowpane. People waited, renewing licenses, vehicle checks, paperwork, routine tasks. But today, no one raised their voices, no one laughed. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting to see who dared exhale first. At the far end of the hallway, a slender 12-year-old girl sat curled up on a bench, her braided hair neat, tied behind her back. Beside her sat her mother, Sarah, pale-faced, gently rubbing her daughter's leg. Emma stared at the tiled floor, but her tear-filled eyes didn't look away. She didn't cling to her mother's arm like a child, instead, she gripped her own hand so tightly her fingernails left marks on her skin. The wooden door opened. A deputy stepped out, scanning a clipboard. "Sarah, your daughter's name is Emma?" The mother nodded. "Yes. She has something she needs to say." Sheriff Grant sat across from Emma. He wasn't in uniform, just a button-down shirt and slacks, his hands resting on the table, careful not to make her feel interrogated. Emma looked up, her eyes clear but heavy with the weight of a child who had seen something even adults struggled to name. "What did you see, Emma?" Grant asked. Emma took a deep breath, her voice rough. "I saw everything. Our house is right behind theirs. From the attic window, you can see straight into Sylvia's cowshed. Many times, I saw her drag Lori outside, tie her hands. Sometimes she taped her mouth shut. One night, she threw her into the hay like a trash bag. Lori cried, but it was quiet, crying without sound. Did you ever tell an adult?" Emma shook her head, eyes downcast. "I wanted to tell my mom, but one time I ran across Sylvia's front yard, and she stared at me. Then she said, 'You talk too much, kid. You won't stay safe.' She didn't yell, but her eyes, they made me freeze." She paused, then added, "I thought maybe I was imagining things, but that night I couldn't sleep. The next day, I didn't go near our backyard again. Every time I saw Lori, I wanted to say something, but I wasn't brave enough." Emma clenched her fists, lifted her head. "But if I keep quiet, she'll still be in that shed, and next time, there won't be a chance to fix it." Sheriff Grant looked at the girl before him. In that moment, she was no longer just a child, she was the first person to say aloud what the entire town had quietly ignored. "You didn't just witness something. You saved a life. You opened the door." In a small office at the station, Blake Rogers, former head of the local community board, sat across from Grant. He was neatly dressed, hair combed to the side, but his shoulders were hunched, as if bracing for something. Grant set a file on the desk. "You'd heard complaints about Sylvia?" "Yes, but they were rumors. No one brought me proof. I couldn't just assume." "Did anyone tell you not to ask?" Blake avoided his gaze. "I didn't want to stir things up. In a small town, keeping the peace matters more than sticking your nose in someone's family." Grant smirked, not amused. "And how peaceful was it for the little girl tied up, beaten, and left in a cowshed?" Blake fell silent. This silence wasn't defensive, it was self-confrontation. Moments later, he pulled a signed letter from his pocket, a resignation. "I'm not fit for this position anymore." Grant nodded, his voice at last a little softer. "You're doing the right thing, even if it's late." That afternoon, an old, dust-covered pickup truck pulled up in front of the station. Out stepped Mark James, Lori's biological father. His eyes were red, his hands shook, his face closed off. Sheriff Grant waited, but before he could speak, Mark slammed his hand on the desk. "Where is she? Where's Sylvia? What did she do to my daughter?" "Sit down," Grant said calmly. Mark continued, "My daughter used to fall asleep on my chest. That woman once promised to raise her like her own, and I believed it. I believed it so much I didn't even see her slowly disappearing." Grant said nothing. Mark lowered his voice, fists clenched. "I don't want to forgive her, not Sylvia, not even myself." Grant slid a photo across the table. Lori in a hospital bed, bruised face, battered wrists, wrapped in a white blanket. Mark looked at it, and for the first time, he cried without a sound. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. If only I'd never left." Back at the hospital, the room was still white, but now a pillow was propped behind Lori's back. A small foldable table stood beside her bed, and a brand new stuffed bear sat next to her, Milo, with a red knit scarf and slightly crooked, stitched eyes that somehow looked real. Lori wasn't afraid of it, on the contrary, she hugged Milo like it had always been there. Outside the window, the sunset spread gently, its pale gold lighting up the bear, the chair, and Richard's hands as he carefully peeled an apple, each slice thin, even, practiced, like a man who'd done this many times before. On the tray sat a small meal. Porridge, boxed milk, a few crackers, and a hardcover children's book, Milo the Rabbit and the Flying Pinwheel, a story Richard had read to his late daughter more than 20 times. Lori ate in silence, small spoonfuls, her cheeks still pale, but her eyes were different. She looked around at the pillow, at the book, at him, not to be on guard, but to see the objects that meant nothing yesterday now had form, had warmth. After the meal, she didn't sleep. Richard didn't ask, he just sat beside her, opened the book, and read. Milo the Rabbit couldn't fly, but he knew how to wait for the wind, and the wind always comes when someone truly wishes it. Lori said nothing, but she rested her head against the pillow, eyes open, no longer hiding. A while later, she asked softly, "Uncle, will my dad come back?" Richard closed the book and looked at her, his voice steady. "He's on his way, and this time, he won't stay behind the door." Lori turned toward the wall, still hugging the bear. Her voice broke, not from tears but from a question no one had taught her how to ask. "Does he still love me?" Richard sat up straighter, no rush in his tone. "I don't know, but if he's sitting next to you today, it's not because he loves you, it's because you're still here to give him a chance." Lori didn't cry, but something in her eyes loosened, as if something had cracked or begun to melt. She turned to him, stared for a long while, then asked, "How long will you stay?" Richard didn't answer right away. He gently lifted her hand, like holding a sprout, and placed it in his palm. "As long as you need me." Lori closed her fingers just slightly. Her eyes still held fear, but now there was a trace of something else, trust. A new day had begun. The dew from the night hadn't fully lifted yet. Sunlight filtered gently through a thin layer of clouds, casting a soft golden light over the old hospital roof. The leaves outside the room still held droplets of water, falling in tiny beads onto the gray concrete below. The air was clean but crisp, like an early autumn morning trying to breathe again after a heavy night. In the recovery room, Lori was already awake. She didn't cry or stir, she simply opened her eyes and looked around, a gaze that wasn't guarded but not yet trusting either. Her stuffed bear, Milo, rested in her arms. On the small tray beside her were a cup of warm milk, a few slices of peanut butter toast, and the same picture book from last night, opened silently to the page where Milo the Rabbit was trying to learn how to fly. Richard sat beside her bed, his chin resting on his hand, dark circles under his eyes, but despite his exhaustion, his gaze still held steady patience. "Would you like something to eat?" he asked gently. Lori gave a small nod. She didn't speak, but she nodded, and that was enough. Downstairs, on the first floor of the hospital, Mark James stood frozen in front of the room directory, his hair unkempt under a faded fabric cap, one hand clutching a small bouquet of wild daisies wrapped in newspaper. The morning breeze crept through the collar of his jacket, trailing down his back, colder than he'd expected, but not as cold as something else, the feeling of a man who had once been a father and had somehow dropped that title somewhere along the road, between long-haul truck stops and silent goodbyes. Will she even recognize me? Or am I just a name left smudged in the corners of her memory, he wondered. He walked slowly toward her room, every step feeling like walking on coals of shame he could no longer put out. Lori turned toward the door. A man she didn't know was standing there. He didn't speak, didn't move quickly. His hands trembled, eyes sunken, the shoulders of his jacket worn thin. In his hands, a bouquet of daisies. The same kind she had once seen in an old photo frame beside her mother's memorial. She squinted slightly, then asked, "Who are you?" Mark tightened his grip on the flowers. He heard her clearly, but he wasn't hurt. He didn't feel rejected because he knew his daughter hadn't forgotten him. She just didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. Time had taken his face, but it hadn't erased her memory of love. Inside her heart, there was still someone called Daddy, but that someone didn't quite match the man trembling before her now. Mark nodded. He stepped slowly into the room. "I'm Mark, the man who held you on your first day, the one who used to be your dad and now just wants to learn how to be that again." Lori didn't answer. She pulled Milo closer and sat still. Mark sank into a chair across the room. He didn't dare come closer. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just to sit here, if you'll let me." No talking, no touching, just sitting, like a chair that doesn't want to be thrown away anymore. Lori tilted slightly, shifting just enough to leave a small space beside her, a space not large, but not closed either. From the doorway, Richard remained quiet. He saw that space, not an invitation, but not a wall either. When the nurse entered to check vitals, Mark quietly stepped out to let them work. Before he left, he turned one last time to look at his child, to see her injuries, to see the eyes that no 3-year-old should ever have to wear. He was filled with regret, with shame, and maybe it was too late, but he saw her. In the hallway, Mark and Richard sat quietly outside the room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a long golden streak across the tile floor. Mark exhaled softly. "I've heard about you. The sheriff told me, and then you saved my daughter at the moment I should have been the one standing there." Richard didn't respond. Mark continued, his voice rough. "I didn't know she was being hurt. I saw her growing thinner, quieter. Her eyes always looked like she was about to cry, but I didn't ask. I said, she'll be fine, but the truth is, I said that for myself. I chose comfort over confrontation." Richard looked at him, not accusing, but not comforting either. Mark lifted his head. "I didn't come to take her back. I came to stand beside her. If the court needs someone to testify that I was absent, that I failed, and now I want to make it right, I'll say it. I may not be fit to be her father, but I can be a witness to the truth." Richard nodded slowly. "I don't believe in words, but I see you're here, and you're not walking away. And what about you? Where are you listening to this story? From a nearly empty bus ride, the corner of your familiar bedroom, or somewhere in the quiet of your own heart? Have you ever stood outside when you should have stepped in? Is there someone whose name you once forgot how to say? Because sometimes, a single word spoken at the right moment is the only thing that can pull someone back from the darkness they don't know how to name. In Granger, that afternoon, the sky was veiled in a thin layer of mist. The cold air crept quietly into shirt collars, giving people chills even though no wind was actually blowing. After a long morning at the hospital, after his conversation with Richard, Mark James didn't go to the sheriff's office. Instead, he quietly drove back to the farm, the place that once was home, where a real family's laughter used to live, and also the place where he had handed his daughter over to someone heartless. The old wooden gate creaked as he pushed it open. Weeds had overgrown the path, wild and untouched. The garden tiles were cracked, patches of mud surrounding the dried-up well. And then, the cowshed. Mark froze when he saw it. He walked toward it slowly, each step heavier under the weight of memory. This was where Lori had been locked in through the night, surrounded by the stench of livestock, moldy straw, and freezing air. He sat down, ran a hand over the damp, stained straw. No one needed to say anything, he saw and understood. My daughter was here. Tears fell, quiet but suffocating. He placed his hand on the coldest spot of the shed floor, as if trying to apologize with his whole body. Daddy's here, Lori. I'm sorry I came back too late. He stood, walked into the house. The old front door groaned open. No one was there, just silence so thick even his own shadow on the floor felt like a stranger. The living room was covered in a light layer of dust, the rug in the center frayed around the edges. On a wooden shelf against the wall sat an old doll, missing hair, one arm broken, its face still smeared with dirt. Near the window, crookedly taped to the wall, was a piece of crumpled paper, waxy colors faded, the corners curled and yellowed with time. Mark stepped closer. Crayon strokes, messy and unrefined, circles with no shape, streaks like trees, and a thick red smear in the center, like a head with no eyes. A single red line crossed where the mouth should have been, no name, no words, just pain. She couldn't speak, but she drew. Mark trembled as he held the paper, his body felt weightless. It's been here all this time, and I never really looked. He collapsed onto the floor, head in his hands. The smell of the house wasn't the scent of life anymore, it was the stench of regret that had never been spoken out loud. An hour later, Mark drove to the sheriff's office, no more tears, only a man walking with the clarity of someone who had just woken up from a 3-year sleep. The metal door closed behind him. Inside the holding cell, Sylvia Patterson sat waiting, her hands cuffed, her eyes cold. Her face was thinner after several days in detention, but her gaze still held that bitter sharpness that had once made the entire neighborhood avoid confronting her. "You here to preach?" she said first, her lips pressed tight. "Spare me the speech." Mark walked up but didn't sit. "I came to look into the eyes of the person who beat my child, locked her in a shed, and taped her mouth shut out of hate." Sylvia chuckled bitterly. "Don't act so wounded. You weren't there. You left everything to me. I fed her, washed her clothes, taught her while you were gone." Mark met her gaze. "I was absent, but I never touched my daughter with hate." Sylvia hissed through her teeth. "You loved her because she was Anna's. Every time you looked at her, I saw myself disappear. I tried to accept it, but I hated her. I hated the way she looked at me, like I was a stranger." Mark stepped closer, voice low. "I used to think I was the worst of us, but now I see I was a coward. You were cruel." Sylvia stiffened. Mark lowered his head, voice slow and deliberate. "I trusted you so much that I didn't see my daughter dying a little more with every year I stayed gone. You called her your child, but every time she cried, you yelled, you hit, you threatened. I have nothing left to say to you, but I will do one last thing that's right as her father. I'll stand before the court and tell them everything, even the things I was too afraid to see." Sylvia said nothing. Her lips trembled, eyes filled with tears, unclear whether from fear or because it was all simply too late. The sharpness in her eyes faded, and something else appeared, a hollow, like someone delivering their own verdict before the judge ever speaks. For the first time, Sylvia's eyes weren't cold, they were lost, like someone who had finally condemned herself. Mark turned to go. The door closed behind him with a dry click. He stood still in the hallway for a few seconds, exhaled, like someone finally breathing after years of choking on silence. As he turned to leave, he paused. At the far end of the hallway, on the bench outside the holding cells, sat Richard Hale. He hadn't knocked, hadn't spoken. He had been there, no one knew how long, but long enough to hear everything. His hands were clasped on his knees, beside him a thin folder, paperwork prepared for the upcoming hearing. His dark coat was neatly pressed, the cuff folded in a familiar crease, a small detail that only someone who had once been a father would care about, especially when stepping into a courtroom where he refused to show up disheveled. Richard didn't speak, he just looked at Mark. And Mark, he didn't need to ask, he already knew the man had heard it all. They looked at each other. No one needed to explain, no one needed forgiveness. And in that soft golden light streaming through the window, a father, not perfect, was beginning to stand for his child for the first time on both feet. Just a look from a man who had once lost to another who had just begun to rise again, a look that said, "We're doing the right thing." Mark gave a small nod, then turned and walked toward Sheriff Grant's desk, where he would sign his official statement. For the first time, that signature didn't represent obligation, it represented awakening. That morning in Granger, the town was no longer the quiet, sleepy place it had always been. Local media gathered outside the county courthouse. Residents arrived silently in steady numbers. They carried no signs, no outrage, no chants, they simply came, as if fulfilling a quiet duty to witness justice for a child once locked in a cowshed during a freezing winter night. Earlier that morning, at the hospital, soft daylight filtered through the recovery room window, casting a warm glow over the white bed and a brand new box of crayons. Lori was coloring, her tiny hands drawing rounded lines with careful strokes. Beside her sat Milo, the teddy bear, now with one button eye stitched back in place and a new red scarf around its neck. Richard sat across from her, holding a small coat and a cup of warm milk. "Today is a special day, little one," he said. "People will be talking about you, about what happened. If you don't want to go, that's okay too." Lori didn't answer. She looked down at her drawing, a simple picture of a house, a dog, and a grown-up holding the hand of a small child. "If Milo goes, I'll go too," she said quietly. Richard gently squeezed her hand, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. No one had expected a 3-year-old to walk into a courtroom to reclaim justice for her own survival. The car stopped in front of the Granger County Courthouse on a misty morning. The sky was muted gray, like it was holding back something it hadn't yet said. The air wasn't cold because of the weather but because of what was about to be revealed. Richard opened the car door and carefully lifted Lori out. She wore a simple white dress, clutching Milo tightly. The red scarf around the bear's neck was clean, a small gift from Richard, now her quiet talisman. Mark was waiting at the courthouse steps. He said nothing when his daughter approached, just nodded softly, eyes downcast. 3 people, a child and 2 imperfect fathers, walked through the heavy courthouse doors under the silent gaze of those gathered outside. No one spoke, but everyone understood, this wasn't just a trial for a crime, it was the end of collective silence. Inside, the Granger courthouse was modest, worn wooden benches, white painted walls, and a high ceiling lit by warm yellow lights. The gentle glow seemed intentional, so as not to shatter the fragile atmosphere that had settled over the room. Sylvia Patterson sat behind the defendant's bench, her face pale, her eyes still sharp but no longer threatening. Her hair was unkempt, her hands cuffed in front of her. Once praised as a model stepmother, she was now just a name followed by the word criminal. Lori sat between Richard and Mark. She didn't cry, didn't speak. Her tiny hand rested gently on Richard's sleeve, a reflex, like her body already knew this was the safest place. Emma was the first to testify. The 8-year-old gripped her mother's shirt, eyes glassy, but her voice was clear. "I saw Lori locked in the cowshed. I asked about it, and she yelled at me, said if I was nosy, I'd die early. I was scared. I didn't tell anyone, but every night I heard her crying, really soft, like she didn't want anyone to know." A sob came from the gallery. Emma's mother pulled her close, both cried together. The room grew heavier. Then another voice stepped forward, strong, unwavering. Dr. Rachel Bennett, the pediatrician who treated Lori, took the stand without needing introduction. "I received Lori in a state of severe hypothermia. She had an old head injury, multiple layers of bruising on her arms, and red marks around her mouth consistent with duct tape. But the most painful part wasn't physical, it was her eyes, not panic, just emptiness, like a child who had already learned no one is coming." She stepped down, no further words were needed. Silence carried the rest. Then came Sheriff Grant, his eyes unable to hide his guilt. "I'm the county sheriff, the man who should have acted sooner. I received a report from Mr. Richard Hale, and when I investigated, what I found was worse than anything I imagined. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to admit the law was late, but this time, it showed up. Mark James, Laurie's biological father, didn't wait to be called. He stepped forward, no papers in hand, no excuse in his eyes. "I'm Laurie's father," and I was silent. I came home and saw the way she looked at me, but I didn't ask. I saw the drawing she'd taped to the wall for 3 years, a circle with no mouth, and I never really looked. I wasn't deceived, I chose not to know. As eyes lingered on Mark, another figure rose from the front row. Richard Hale. He didn't raise his voice, but the room stilled as he spoke. "I share no blood with that child. I was just a man driving by that night, and I heard crying from a place no one should ever cry. I didn't save her, she saved me with that look, with that first hug, with the trust she should never have had left." Richard didn't bow his head, didn't pretend to be strong. He let the truth settle in the center of the room. And then, from the back row, Blake Rogers, the community leader, stood up. He removed the pin from his jacket. "I never hurt anyone, but I stayed quiet. I got reports, I heard kids say Laurie always sleeps out there, and I said, no proof, don't get involved. I called it keeping peace, but really, I kept evil undisturbed." He laid his badge down on the witness podium. "I resign. I'm not here for forgiveness, I'm here so I won't be silent again." Following the testimonies, the judge struck the gavel. Sylvia Patterson was sentenced to 10 years in prison with a permanent restriction from contact with minors. The courtroom remained silent, no applause, no cheers, only eyes, once silent, now turned to Laurie with something like penance. Mark stood beside Richard. Before them was a legal guardianship document, Laurie's name printed clearly in the top corner. A court officer handed Mark a pen. He didn't take it right away. Instead, he looked at Richard, then at the child curled in his arms. Laurie didn't turn away, she just held Milo close, resting her cheek on Richard's shoulder, a familiar, safe place. Mark took a breath, and for the first time that entire trial, he spoke softly, but each word landed clear. "I don't expect her to forgive me, but I want at least a part of her burden to finally be held by the right person." He leaned down, signed. The signature was steady, even, not a line out of place. Richard said nothing, he simply placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, not as praise, but as recognition, from one man who had lost everything to another man finally starting to try. 1 hour later, after the crowd had left the courthouse, the news was everywhere. Local headlines exploded, social media flooded like a wave. The Granger Tribune ran the bold headline, "The Demon in the Cowshed, the Dark Side of a Stepmother." An editorial spread like wildfire, "Granger used to be silent. We used to say, it's not my business, but today, we no longer have the right to say, I didn't know." Images circulated, Mark and Sylvia captured after the hearing, the caption reading, "One hit, one looked away." Mark never fought back, never made a public statement, never wrote a rebuttal. That night, he stood alone on the porch of a rented room, holding a folded newspaper in his hands. He read, then said nothing, no anger, no denial, no avoidance, because he understood, a real father isn't someone who defends himself well, he's someone who knows when to stay quiet and when to act while there's still time to make things right. That afternoon, the trial ended in silence. No cheers, no applause, just the soft sound of footsteps leaving the room where, at last, the truth had been called by its name. In the long hallway outside, Richard sat on an old wooden bench, holding Laurie in his lap. She nestled against him, hugging Milo the teddy bear, as always. Her eyes were half closed, tired but not afraid. In her small hand was half a cookie, crumbs scattered on her white sweater. Mark followed behind, still in the same old white shirt, still standing with that slight lean forward, like someone always about to step closer but stopping just at the edge. And then Laurie lifted her head and whispered softly, "Daddy, are we going home?" Richard didn't answer right away, he simply patted her back gently. Mark froze in place. That single word, "Daddy," so light, so simple, landed like a punch to the chest, not because she called the wrong person, but because she chose to say it on her own, without being told. He turned his face away, and within that pain came a realization: she doesn't need someone to play the role of dad, she just needs someone to be there when she's scared, and this time, that someone isn't me. Weeks later, Lori was discharged on a windless, quiet morning. Richard and Mark both came to pick her up. The guardianship papers had been signed. Richard's small home now had a child's bed, a coloring table, a night light shaped like a bear, and a little girl learning how to smile for real. Lori no longer flinched at the sound of thunder. She called Richard Dad, like it had always been true. She didn't call Mark anything, but every time she saw him, she waved. She didn't avoid him, she wasn't close, but she didn't reject him either. Mark often came in the late afternoons. He didn't go inside, he just stood outside the fence, holding small things, a picture book, a can of milk, or a butterfly-shaped hair clip, not to beg for forgiveness, just to be near. One evening, Richard was peeling carrots in the kitchen. Lori sat in the living room, holding Milo, reading a book aloud to herself. She shouted, "Daddy," read the part where the cat talks again. Richard laughed. "I'm making soup. Give me a minute." At that exact moment, Mark stepped onto the porch. He heard it clearly. It didn't sting, it just settled quietly. He sat on the doorstep and placed the book on his knee. He didn't knock, didn't ask to come in, he just sat there, like someone who knew he had missed something beautiful but was grateful to still see it from a distance. Maybe I don't have to be the one she calls. Maybe it's enough just to be the one who stays. On a damp afternoon, a light rain began to fall. The backyard gate creaked open. Lucky, the old dog, walked in, back hunched, one leg still limping. His fur was still scruffy, but his eyes held more light than the day he was rescued. Lori screamed, "Lucky!" Without waiting, she dashed outside like a gust of wind. Richard jogged after her, laughing quietly. Mark froze, his heart twisting. Lucky didn't bark. He gently tugged on the red scarf around Milo's neck, then lay down on the porch, resting his head on Lori's feet, as if he'd never been gone. A veterinarian later said, "I've never seen a dog survive purely on instinct to protect." One day, Lori asked, "Daddy, do we have a mum in our house?" Richard sat beside her bed. "No, but we have you, and when we have you, our house doesn't feel like it's missing anything." Lori nodded, then turned to hug Milo. Her eyes closed, no fear, no panic, just sleep, like a child who finally knows she is safe. A few months later, after the storm surrounding a 3-year-old child had passed, the farm was peaceful in a way it had never been before, not because nothing happened anymore, but because, for the first time, people had learned to look at each other with honest eyes. And in a small house at the end of Claymore Street, sunlight poured across the yard. Children's laughter echoed from the porch. Lori, once the girl locked in a cowshed, now ran barefoot through the garden, a red scarf tied around her neck like a superhero's cape. It was a very special morning. Lori's first day of preschool. She wore a pink dress, carried a bunny-shaped backpack, and held Milo the teddy bear in her arms. Richard tied her shoelaces. Mark stood nearby, carefully labeling her star-shaped lunchbox with "Lori, Little Bear Class." Lucky, the old dog, lay under the plum tree, eyes half closed. Though aged, he still refused to let her go to school without a proper send-off. Lori looked at the two men, not confused, not questioning. She simply asked, "I have two dads, right?" Richard smiled and nodded. Mark pressed his lips together, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Then Lori whispered, "So, after school, where do I go home to?" Neither of them rushed to answer. Richard gently smoothed her hair. "Wherever you want to go, that's where you go, because now you have 2 homes, 2 bedrooms, and 2 people always waiting for you." After the trial, Mark voluntarily left his job at the old factory, the one that had kept him away for 3 years while his daughter grew up without him. He learned bike repair near home and opened a small shop. The income wasn't much, but he could be home before sunset. He rented an apartment 7 blocks from Richard's house. It wasn't fancy, but it had a small room painted pink, a tiny bed, a few children's books, and a photo frame, Lori hugging Lucky, with both Mark and Richard smiling behind her. Lori could stay wherever she wanted. Some days, she came home with Richard, some nights, she slept at Mark's. And sometimes, when a bad dream woke her in the middle of the night, she'd knock on one of their doors, and whoever opened it never asked why. They just held her close and picked up where the bedtime story had left off. One afternoon, Lucky lay stretched across the yard. Lori sat beside the old dog, gently picking leaves from his fur. She hummed softly. Richard was tending the garden, Mark was fixing the front door lock. Lori looked at both of them and asked, "Is it okay if I don't remember my mum?" Mark came and sat beside her. "It's okay. You don't have to remember with your mind, because as long as you're still loved, it means she never really left." Lori looked up at her biological father, the man who had once been silent for too long, then turned to Richard, the man who had no blood tied to her. She nodded, light as a breeze. "I see my mum in both my dads." That night, Richard wrote one line in his journal, "We thought we were saving a child, but it turns out she saved us." To you, the one who has followed this story all the way here, you walked with Lori out of that cold, damp cowshed. You sat through quiet hospital nights, entered the courtroom where truth was torn open, and in the end, watched a home take shape, not from blood, but from choice. Have you ever known someone who wasn't family by blood but loved you like one? Share a memory, because maybe your story will reach someone who needs a bit of hope right now. May you always have someone to return to, even if you don't share a last name, because family isn't always where we're born. Sometimes, it's where someone chooses to stay and walk beside us. Thank you for listening, and may your heart feel just a little warmer after this story.